I'm Scott McAllister, developer advocate at vCluster. What I want to do is take just the next 5 minutes and talk about tenancy inside of Kubernetes. We are a tenancy product inside of Kubernetes, and I want to share with you some of the things that we've been learning from our users and how they need to do tenancy inside of their Kubernetes clusters and inside their environments. When you think about tenancy, there's a great spectrum. The folks over at LearnCube have made this spectrum where you say, on the one side, you have namespaces, and those namespaces, yeah, you can separate tenancy a little bit there by giving people a namespace and saying, hey, this team's in this namespace, this team's in that namespace. However, what happens when you have things that are on the cluster level? Say like CRDs, you want to install CRDs into the environment, and this team wants to have one version while the other team wants to have another version. Things get a little complicated. So then we go to the other end of the spectrum, and we have full dedicated clusters, which are great. Those definitely isolate your tenants. However, then you have a little bit more work because you're going to be managing each of those dedicated clusters. And also, if you're running on top of a cloud service, how much does it cost to spin up a cluster? Right? Those costs are going to keep coming in. And so at vCluster, the folks over at LearnCube put vCluster here somewhere in the middle, where they described us as having a control plane as a service. So vCluster essentially is a Kubernetes cluster that runs inside of a pod, inside of your own hosted cluster. So you have a hosted cluster here that you have running on your environment, and then vCluster is essentially a way to have your own API server, your own data store, and control manager so that you can have a cluster that is essentially your own, but then also you can expand them inside of your hosted cluster when you need them, and then also spin them down when you don't. What we've seen with our users is there's essentially 3 different ways folks are using this idea or having multi-tenancy inside of their environment. First is this shared nodes environment, where you have your vClusters and you say, hey, we're going to be running inside of this host cluster, and we're going to be sharing all of the nodes inside of that cluster. This is great for efficiency, great for hardware efficiency, especially when you're thinking of things like CPU and GPU utilization. You want to be thinking about how you can maximize each one of these nodes so they can maximize that hardware that's running underneath them. Then you have situations where maybe you need a little bit of separation. You don't want to have a round-robin sort of approach to your nodes. And so you want to essentially associate a cluster with a specific node. So in this case, what you can do is you can have dedicated nodes by setting labels and say, okay, this tenant is going to be running in this specific node for you. And you can specify that, which is great because now you can have your own nodes tied to your own tenants. However, in this environment, just as in the previous environment, you're still sharing some things. You're still sharing your container network and your container storage. So in those cases, folks are saying, well, okay, we have customers, say, hypothetically, right? We have customers that we're giving Kubernetes clusters to, and we're saying one is Coke and the other one is Pepsi, and they don't want any type of cross-pollination happening inside of that host cluster. So in this case here, you would have something called private nodes. So you have a private node that has complete isolation between all of the other vClusters in your host cluster, and then that way, in this case, you can have very, very isolated situations, but still have the efficiency of having your Kubernetes cluster running, Kubernetes cluster control plane running inside of a pod inside of your host cluster. Why does this matter now? Because tenancy is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Even inside your own company, you might start out and say, well, we need multi-tenants for our internal development environments, but then eventually progress where you have, say, internal production environments where you need a little bit more isolation so you can have those dedicated nodes. But then if you're going to be providing clusters to your customers and you want complete isolation between those different clusters, you can have private nodes. So in a situation, a customer or a company may need all of those different situations, and vCluster is the solution that allows you to have that flexibility inside of your Kubernetes clusters. Come find us out in the hallway. We have recently, as in like this week, we released a GPU-enabled platform on Kubernetes ebook. The ebook is free. The QR code is not there because it's at our booth. So come find us at our booth. Thank you.